Imagine, for a moment, if you listen closely to the history of America, past the speeches of politicians and the glorious songs of revolution, you will hear a different sound. It is a low, scratching sound. It is the sound of a fingernail clawing against stone in the dark. It is the sound of a man trying to remind himself that he exists. Imagine, just for a moment, waking up in total darkness. The air is thick and hot, smelling of damp earth and old sickness. You try to move your hand to rub your eyes, expecting to feel the soft cotton of your bed sheets, but instead, your wrist is jerked back. A cold, hard weight bites into your skin. Iron. Heavy, rusted iron. You try to stand, but your legs are bound. You are not in your home. You are not in your bed. You are buried alive in a stone box, and the life you knew, the name you answered to, the people who loved you, has vanished as if it never existed. This isn't a scene from a horror movie. This was the reality for a man named Solomon Northup. And his story isn't just a tragedy, it is a terrifying reminder of how quickly the light can be turned off. You see, before the chains, before the darkness, there was light. Bright, beautiful sunlight in Saratoga Springs, New York. The year was 1841. It feels important to start here in the light because you need to understand what was stolen. Solomon wasn't born into chains. He was a free man, a citizen. He walked down the streets of Saratoga with his head held high. He had a wife, Anne, whom he loved dearly. He had 3 children, Elizabeth, Margaret, and Alonzo. He was a carpenter, a raftman, and above all, a musician. Oh, how he could play the violin. When Solomon drew his bow across the strings, people stopped to listen. It was his gift, his joy, and tragically, the very thing that would be used to destroy him. Now, imagine a crisp afternoon in late March. Solomon is walking through the village, looking for work. The tourist season hasn't quite started yet, so money is a little tight. He is approached by 2 men. They look respectable. They are well-dressed white men who introduce themselves as Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton. They have smooth voices and easy smiles. They tell Solomon they belong to a circus company, a traveling spectacle of magic and wonder. They say they are looking for a talented violinist to travel with them, just for a short while, to play for their shows. They offer him wages that are generous, far more than he could make hauling lumber. They offer to pay his travel expenses. It sounds like a dream come true. It sounds like the kind of lucky break that changes a man's year. Come with us to New York City, they say. Just for a few days, you'll be back with your pockets full of gold before your wife even misses you. And here is the first tragedy of our story. Solomon trusts them. Why shouldn't he? He has lived his life as a free man among free men. He judges people by their character, not by the color of their skin or the darkness in their hearts. He accepts the offer. He doesn't tell his wife, perhaps thinking it will be a wonderful surprise when he returns with money for the family. He packs his violin, he climbs into their carriage, and just like that, the trap snaps shut. But he doesn't hear the click yet. The cage is still invisible. The journey begins with laughter and good food. Brown and Hamilton treat Solomon like a king. They arrive in New York City, and the energy is electric. But then the plan changes. They tell Solomon the circus isn't in New York anymore. It has moved south to Washington, D.C. Now, this should have been a red flag. Washington, D.C. in 1841 was slave territory. New York was free, but once you crossed that line, the rules of the universe shifted. But Brown and Hamilton are clever. They are master manipulators. They tell Solomon to get free papers, documents proving he is a free citizen, just to be safe. They act like his protectors. They lull him into a false sense of security. So they travel south. They cross into New Jersey, then Philadelphia, then Baltimore. With every mile, the air gets heavier. The way people look at Solomon changes. In the north, he was a man.
Here, he is a question mark. He is a suspect.
They arrive in Washington, D.C. at a strange, somber time. The city is in mourning. President William Henry Harrison has just died. The streets are draped in black crepe. Church bells are tolling a slow, mournful rhythm. It sets a scene of dread, though Solomon doesn't know it yet. They check into Gadsby's hotel. It's a nice place. They have a good dinner. The wine flows. Brown and Hamilton are telling jokes, keeping the mood light despite the gloom outside. But then Solomon starts to feel strange. A headache begins to throb behind his eyes. His stomach turns. The room starts to spin. He thinks it's just the wine, or maybe something he ate, but it hits him hard and fast. The faces of his friends start to blur. Their voices sound like they're coming from underwater. They tell him to go upstairs and lie down. "Sleep it off, Solomon," they say. "You'll feel better in the morning." He stumbles to his room. He collapses onto the bed. The last thing he remembers is the soft mattress and the darkness closing in. When he wakes up, the mattress is gone. The hotel room is gone. The smell of dinner is replaced by the stench of stale urine and damp stone. His head is splitting open, a pain so intense it makes him gasp. He reaches out, confused, groggy, trying to find the bedside table, but his hand hits a wall, a cold, wet stone wall. He tries to stand up, but something jerks him back down. He looks at his ankles. In the dim light filtering through a grate high above, he sees them. Fetters. Heavy iron chains locking his legs together. He looks at his wrists. Handcuffs. The realization hits him like a physical blow to the gut. He checks his pockets. His money is gone. His free papers, the proof of his life, his identity, are gone. Panic sets in. He screams. He yells for Brown and Hamilton. "Help me, I've been robbed." He still thinks it's a robbery. He thinks they are victims too, but no one comes. Hours pass in that dark, stinking hole. Finally, the heavy wooden door creaks open. A man steps in. He is not Brown. He is not Hamilton. He is a man with a face like thunder, a man named James Birch. He is a slave dealer. He runs this pen, known as the Yellow House, right in the shadow of the Capitol building. He looks at Solomon with cold, dead eyes. "What's all the noise about?" he asks. Solomon, mustering every ounce of dignity he has left, stands up as best he can in his chains. He looks Birch in the eye. "I am a free man," he says. "I am from New York. My name is Solomon Northup. You have made a terrible mistake. Let me go." Birch doesn't flinch. He doesn't look surprised. He just shakes his head. "You're a liar," he says. "You're not from New York. You're a runaway slave from Georgia, and you're mine now." Solomon protests. He shouts the truth. "I have a wife. I have children. I am free." And this is where the nightmare truly begins. Birch doesn't argue with words. He grabs a paddle, a thick wooden board with holes bored into it to create maximum pain without breaking the skin too quickly. He orders his assistant to strip Solomon naked, and then he beats him. He beats him with a fury that is hard to comprehend. Every time the paddle strikes, Birch screams, "Are you a slave?" And every time, through the agony, Solomon gasps, "No, I am free!"
The paddle breaks. It snaps from the force of the blows, but Birch isn't done. He grabs a cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip with knotted cords. He continues the assault. He whips Solomon until the skin on his back is shredded, until the blood runs down to the floor. The pain is blinding. It is a universe of fire. Eventually, Solomon's mind begins to fracture. He realizes that the truth doesn't matter here. The truth is what the man with the whip says it is. To stop the pain, to simply survive the next minute, he has to stop saying he is free. He collapses, weeping, broken, into the dirt. Birch stands over him, breathless, and delivers the final verdict. "Your name is Platt," he spits. "You are a runaway, and if you ever mention New York again, I will kill you." And just like that, in the dark cellar of the nation's capital, Solomon Northup died, and a slave named Platt was born. The days that followed in that dungeon were a blur of agony and silence. Solomon lay on the cold ground, his back a map of raw, weeping wounds, his spirit battered into a corner of his mind. Every time the heavy door opened, his heart would seize, expecting the whip again. But instead of violence, something arguably worse began to happen: the erasure of his past. He had to learn to answer to Platt. It wasn't just a name, it was a survival mechanism. If he didn't answer, he starved. If he didn't answer, he bled. And slowly, the terrifying reality of his situation began to sink in. He wasn't just kidnapped, he was being processed. He was inventory. Eventually, in the dead of night, the order came to move. Handcuffed to strangers, men and women whose eyes were wide with the same terror he felt, Solomon was marched out into the cool night air of Washington, D.C. The city was asleep. They shuffled in silence, the chains clanking softly, a ghostly procession moving through the capital of liberty. They passed the Capitol building itself, its great white dome glowing in the moonlight, a beacon of democracy that was utterly blind to the human chattel being dragged past its gates. The irony was so sharp it felt like a physical weight on his chest. Here he was, a man who had walked these streets freely, now being stolen right under the nose of the government that was supposed to protect him. They reached the wharf, where a steamboat named the Orleans waited like a darkly breathing beast. They were herded onto the deck and then shoved down into the hold. The smell hit them first: tar, bilge water, and the distinct sour musk of confined bodies. This was the Middle Passage reimagined for the American coast. Once the boat pushed off, the engine's rhythmic thumping became the heartbeat of their misery. They were heading down the Potomac, past the grave of George Washington, drifting further and further from the world of the free. In the gloom of the hold, the social barriers fell away. Solomon met the others. There was Robert, a young man with a spirit as fiery as Solomon's, who had also been kidnapped. There was Arthur, a bricklayer from Norfolk, snatched from the streets. And there was a woman named Eliza, clutching a young daughter, weeping silently for a son who had been left behind. They were a family of the damned, bound together by a common nightmare. As the Orleans cut through the waves, heading for the open ocean and down toward the Gulf of Mexico, a dangerous idea began to form. Solomon and Arthur, whispering in the dark while the guards slept, started to plot. They weren't just going to accept this fate. They were men. They outnumbered the crew. They scanned the hold, counting the able-bodied men, whispering plans of mutiny. The plan was desperate but simple. Wait until they were on the high seas, rush the hatch, kill the captain and the crew, and sail the ship to New York. It was a suicide mission, perhaps, but the alternative, a life of slavery in the deep South, seemed worse than death. You can imagine the tension in that cramped space, the adrenaline, the hope that flared up like a match in a windstorm. Solomon, with his knowledge of waterways and navigation, would be the captain. For a few days, they lived on this hope. It gave them a reason to breathe. It gave them back a shred of their manhood. But fate, it seems, can be cruel in ways we can't anticipate. Before they could launch their attack, sickness struck the ship. It wasn't just seasickness, it was the dreaded smallpox. It started with a fever, then the rash. Robert, the strongest of them, the one Solomon was counting on for the fight, fell ill. He deteriorated rapidly. The guards, terrified of the contagion, stopped coming down as often, but it didn't matter. The mutiny died before it could be born, because the soldiers were too weak to stand. Solomon watched his friend Robert die in that filthy hold. He watched the light go out of his eyes, and with it, the last hope of seizing the ship. The crew tossed Robert's body overboard like garbage, splashing into the gray Atlantic waves. It was a stark reminder of their value. Dead or alive, they were just cargo. If you spoiled, you were discarded. Solomon survived the outbreak, but the fire of rebellion had to be banked down deep inside him. He had to pivot from fighter to survivor.
The journey seemed to last a lifetime, but eventually the water changed color. The blue of the ocean turned to the muddy brown of the Mississippi River. The air became thick, humid and heavy, smelling of swamp and decay. They were entering the mouth of the South. They passed sugar plantations stretching out along the riverbanks, the fields dotted with bent figures laboring under the sun. Solomon watched them through the portholes, a cold dread settling his stomach. That was his future. That was Platt's destiny. When the Orleans finally docked in New Orleans, the sheer scale of the operation became clear. This wasn't a back-alley deal. This was a massive industrialized machine of human trafficking.
They were unloaded and marched to the slave pen of a man named Theophilus Freeman. Freeman was a different kind of monster than Birch. He was a businessman, a salesman. He looked at Solomon and the others not with hatred, but with the critical eye of a cattle rancher. And then began the humiliating process of preparation. You see, you couldn't sell a slave who looked broken and dirty. They had to be polished. They were told to wash. They were given new clothes. Cheap, ill-fitting suits for the men, calico dresses for the women. They were told to shine their shoes. Freeman walked among them, instructing them on how to act. "Stand up straight," he'd bark. "Look lively. Smile." Imagine the psychological torture of that. You have just been kidnapped, beaten, and dragged halfway across the continent, and now you were told to smile for the man who was about to buy your life. You were forced to participate in your own sale. Freeman was particularly interested in Solomon because Solomon looked intelligent and strong. But he warned him, if anyone asks, you don't know how to read and you don't know how to write. Intelligence was a liability. A smart slave was a dangerous slave. So Solomon had to dim his light. He had to play the part of a simpleton. He had to hide the fact that he could discuss politics, that he could read sheet music, that he had run a business. He had to make himself smaller to fit into the box they had built for him. The pen was filled with customers, planters from up the Red River, cotton men, sugar men. They walked through the rows of people like they were browsing for furniture. They poked chests, checked teeth, asked women to spin around. They asked invasive, disgusting questions. Solomon stood there, his heart hammering, as men touched his arms and debated his price. He was a man who used to hire other men. Now he was being haggled over like a sack of flour. It was in this showroom of horrors that the next chapter of his life would be decided. He watched as Eliza, the mother who had wept the whole journey, was separated from her children. The scene was wrenching. Her daughter was sold to one man, her son to another. Eliza screamed. She grabbed Freeman's knees, begging him to keep them together. But Freeman just kicked her away, annoyed by the noise. "Shut up," he yelled, "or I'll give you something to cry about." Solomon watched this family being torn apart, atom by atom, and he realized that in this place, love was a weakness. Attachments were dangerous. If you loved something, they could use it to hurt you. And yet he couldn't stop thinking about his own children back in Saratoga. He wondered if he would ever see them again, or if he would die here, in the sweltering heat of Louisiana, known only as Platte, the property of a stranger. The hammer of the auction block was about to fall, and with it, the final seal on his freedom would be broken.
The transaction was finished with a handshake. Money changed hands, hard currency for a living, breathing soul. And just like that, Solomon belonged to a man named William Ford. Now, this is where the story enters a strange, gray area that is often difficult for modern minds to comprehend. When we think of slave masters, we think of the whip-cracking villains, the monsters. But William Ford was not a monster. He was a Baptist preacher. He was a gentle, soft-spoken man who read the Bible to his slaves every Sunday. He was, by all accounts of the time, a good Christian. And yet, he bought Solomon. He looked at a human being and saw a purchase. This contradiction is one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire system because it shows how deep the rot went. It wasn't just the cruel men who sustained slavery. It was the kind ones, too. The ones who treated their slaves like beloved pets rather than people. Solomon was loaded onto a steamboat, then a train, and finally a wagon, traveling deeper into the heart of Louisiana, into a region known as the Great Pine Woods. The landscape here was ancient and imposing. Towering pine trees blocked out the sun, and the air was thick with the scent of resin and swamp water. It was a beautiful, wild place, but for Solomon, it was a prison without walls. As they rode, Ford spoke kindly to him. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He asked Solomon about his health. It was disarming. It made Solomon's guard drop just an inch. He found himself wanting to please this man, wanting to prove his worth, not just to avoid punishment, but because human beings are wired to seek approval, even from their captors.
It's a psychological state often called Stockholm Syndrome today, but back then it was just survival. Upon arriving at Ford's plantation on the banks of Bayou Boeuf, Solomon was put to work. But because he was intelligent and skilled, he wasn't sent to the cotton fields immediately. Ford saw something in him. He saw the way Solomon handled tools, the way he looked at a problem and solved it. Solomon was assigned to work in the lumber mill. Now, remember, Solomon was a free man from New York who had run his own business. He knew about timber. He knew about logistics. He looked at the way Ford's men were moving logs, dragging them laboriously through the mud, and he saw a better way. This was a dangerous moment. A slave wasn't supposed to have ideas. A slave wasn't supposed to be smarter than the white overseers. If he spoke up, he could be whipped for insolence. But Solomon took the risk. He approached Ford. "Master," he said, keeping his eyes low but his voice steady, "if we build rafts, we can float the timber down the creek. It would be faster." The white overseers laughed. They mocked him. "What does a Negro know about engineering?" they sneered. But Ford listened. He looked at Solomon, really looked at him, and nodded. "Let him try," Ford said. So Solomon went to work. He built the rafts. He organized the flow, and it worked perfectly. The timber moved faster than it ever had before. Ford was delighted. He praised Solomon. He gave him extra food. He started to treat him almost like a foreman. For a brief window of time, life at the Great Pine Woods was bearable. Solomon became a favorite. He was known as the smartest slave on the plantation. On Sundays, he would sit in the grass while Ford read from the Gospels, preaching about love and kindness in the kingdom of heaven. Solomon would listen, and a war would rage inside his heart. He wanted to scream, "If you are a Christian, how can you own me? If you believe in justice, why am I here?" But he stayed silent. He realized that Ford was his shield. As long as he was owned by Ford, he was safe from the worst brutalities of the South. He even considered telling Ford the truth. He played the scenario out in his head 1,000 times. He would fall to his knees, confess his true name, tell him about Anne and the children, and Ford, being a man of God, would be horrified and send him home. It was a seductive fantasy. But fear is a powerful gag. Solomon had seen what happened to slaves who claimed to be free. They were beaten until they admitted they were lying. Did he trust Ford enough to risk his life? He looked at the kind face of the preacher and saw the line he couldn't cross. Ford was kind, yes, but he was still a master. He was still part of the system, and Solomon couldn't be sure if the property owner in Ford would outweigh the Christian in him. So he kept his secret. He locked Solomon Northup away in a dark corner of his mind and continued to be Platt, the clever carpenter. But the tragedy of a slave's life is that it is entirely dependent on the fortunes of the master. You are an asset, like a chair or horse. And William Ford, for all his kindness, was not a good businessman. He had debts. He had made bad investments. The shadow of financial ruin began to creep over the plantation. Solomon could sense the tension in the big house. He saw the worry on Ford's face. He heard the hushed arguments about money. And then the day came that every slave fears. The creditors came calling. To settle his debts, Ford had to liquidate his assets, and his most valuable liquid assets were his people. Solomon was working in the mill when he received the news. He wasn't being sold outright, not yet, but he was being transferred. He was being mortgaged to a man named John M. Tybeats to work off a debt. If Ford was the light, Tybeats was the darkness. Tybeats was a carpenter who worked on the plantation, but he was a small, mean, vindictive man. He had watched Solomon's rise with jealous eyes. He hated that a black man was a better carpenter than he was. He hated that Ford favored Solomon. He had been waiting for a chance to put Platt in his place. When Solomon was handed over to Tybeats, he looked back at Ford. Ford looked sad. He told Tybeats, "Treat him well. He's a good boy." But as Ford rode away, leaving Solomon with Tybeats, the protection vanished. The shield was gone. Solomon was now at the mercy of a man who wanted to break him, not for profit, but for pleasure. The air in the pine woods seemed to grow colder. The birds seemed to stop singing. Solomon knew, with a sinking dread, that the vacation was over. The real nightmare of the Red River was about to begin. He was no longer the valued engineer. He was the target of a weak man's rage. And in the South, there was no more dangerous place to be than in the sights of a white man who felt inferior to you. If William Ford was a man who tried to reconcile slavery with heaven, John Tybeats was a man who brought hell to earth. He was a small man, physically slight, with a pockmarked face and a temper that snapped like dry kindling. From the moment Solomon was placed under his control, a dangerous dynamic formed. You see, Tybeats wasn't just cruel, he was incompetent. He was a carpenter who couldn't cut a straight line, a manager who couldn't organize a day's work, and he knew it. Deep down in the insecurity that festered in his gut, he knew that the slave standing next to him, this man called Platt, was smarter, stronger, and more skilled than he would ever be. That knowledge ate him alive. Every time Solomon planed a board perfectly, every time he leveled a beam that Tybeats had botched, it was an insult. Tybeats didn't want a worker. He wanted a punching bag to make himself feel big. And Solomon, who had spent 30 years as a free man, had a hard time playing the part of the submissive fool. The tension built day by day, like static electricity in the air before a storm. You could feel it. The other slaves kept their heads down, terrified to be caught in the crossfire, but Solomon stood tall. He worked hard, he did his job, but he refused to cower. And that refusal was what finally lit the fuse. It happened on a Friday. They were working on a weaving house, nailing clapboards to the frame. Tybeats was in a foul mood, pacing back and forth, looking for an excuse to explode. He found one. He pointed to a piece of work Solomon had done, work that was perfectly fine, mind you, and claimed it was wrong. He screamed that the nails were crooked, that the board was warped. It was a lie, and they both knew it. But Tybeats wasn't interested in the truth. He was interested in dominance. He shrieked, his face turning a blotchy red. He reached for his whip. Now, in 99% of these stories, this is where the slave submits. They have to. The punishment for fighting back is death. But Solomon, the spirit of the New York citizen, was still alive in him. As Tybeats raised the whip, he didn't flinch. He didn't beg. He waited. And the moment Tybeats swung, Solomon moved. He caught the arm in midair. Imagine the shock that must have frozen the scene. A slave catching a master's hand. Solomon didn't stop there. He yanked the whip away, threw it to the ground, and grabbed Tybeats by the throat. They wrestled in the dirt. Solomon, fueled by months of suppressed rage and the injustice of his stolen life, overpowered him easily. He threw Tybeats to the ground, and in a moment of pure, blind fury, he started to choke him. He could have killed him right there. His hands were on the throat of his tormentor. It would have been easy. But a voice in his head, perhaps the voice of reason or perhaps just the survival instinct, screamed, "Stop." Killing a white man was a one-way ticket to a lynching. Solomon let go. Tybeats scrambled up, gasping for air, his eyes wide with terror and humiliation. He ran. He jumped on his horse and galloped away, screaming threats over his shoulder.
Solomon stood alone in the silence of the unfinished house. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. What had he done? He had crossed the ultimate line. He knew Tybeats wasn't running away. He was running for help. He was running to get a rope. The other slaves looked at Solomon with a mixture of awe and pity. They knew what was coming. Solomon considered running to the swamp, but the swamp was a death trap of alligators and snakes, and he didn't know the terrain. So he did the only thing he could do. He waited. He sat on a log and waited for the consequences of his dignity. It didn't take long. Tybeats returned with 2 other men. They were carrying a coil of thick rope. They had pistols in their belts. Tybeats was emboldened now, safe behind his backup. They approached Solomon with grim determination. They ordered him to cross his hands. Solomon surrendered. He knew fighting 3 armed men was impossible. They tied his wrists tightly with a cord that bit into his flesh. Then they threw the rope over a high branch of a peach tree. Tybeats made a noose. He was trembling with excitement, a sick eagerness to reclaim his power.
He slipped the rough hemp around Solomon's neck and began to pull. The rope tightened. Solomon was hoisted up. His feet left the ground. He couldn't breathe. The world began to spin. This was it. This was the end. He was going to die here, swaying from a peach tree in Louisiana, nameless and forgotten. But then, the plantation overseer, a man named Chapin, stepped out of his house. Chapin was a stern man, but he was practical. He saw what was happening, a lynching on his watch. He walked out with pistols in his hands. "Stop!" he shouted. Tibbets froze. Chapin argued that Solomon was mortgaged property. He technically belonged to Ford, and Tibbets had no right to kill him and destroy Ford's investment. It was a cold economic argument, but it saved Solomon's life. Tibbets, furious but cowardly, let go of the rope. Solomon dropped down, but not all the way, and this is the image that haunts history. Tibbets and his men left, but they didn't untie him. They left him bound, the noose still around his neck, the rope tied taut to the tree trunk. Solomon was left standing on his tiptoes. If he relaxed his legs, the noose would tighten and strangle him. If he fainted, he would hang. He had to stand, stretched to his absolute limit, just to keep his airway open. He stood there as the sun climbed high into the sky. The heat became a physical weight. The flies began to swarm around his face, biting his eyes, his nose, his lips. He couldn't swat them away because his hands were bound. His thirst became a torture. His legs began to cramp, the muscles screaming in agony. Hours passed. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3. The plantation life went on around him. Other slaves walked by, keeping their eyes on the ground, terrified that if they offered him water, they would be next. Tibbets's wife came out onto the porch of the big house, just a few yards away. She looked at Solomon, a man dying by inches in her front yard, and then she coolly turned away and went back inside. It was a display of callousness so profound it freezes the blood. Solomon was treated worse than a dog. You wouldn't leave a dog choking on a leash in the sun, but he was left there. As the afternoon wore on, the pain became unbearable. His legs were swelling. His tongue was swollen in his mouth. He prayed for death. He prayed for the sun to go down. He hallucinated. He saw flashes of his wife, his children, the streets of Saratoga. He wondered if this was hell, and in a way it was. He was suspended between life and death, held up only by the sheer stubborn will to not let Tibbets win. Finally, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, turning the sky a blood red, hooves thundered on the road. It was William Ford. He had been alerted by a messenger. Ford jumped from his horse, his face pale with shock. He took a knife and slashed the rope. Solomon collapsed into the dirt, unable to speak, unable to move, his body a trembling wreck of pain. Ford helped him up, carried him inside, but the damage was done, not just to his body, but to his soul. Solomon realized that night, as he lay in the dark nursing his swollen limbs, that there was no justice here. There was no mercy. There was only power, and he had none of it. He also knew he couldn't stay. Tibbets would try again. Next time there would be no overseer. Next time there would be no Ford. He had to get away, or he would be buried in the Louisiana mud within the week.
The night after the hanging was a sleepless one. Solomon lay on the floor of the cabin, his neck stiff and bruised, his wrists raw from the ropes, listening to the sounds of the night. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind in the pines sounded like Tibbets returning. You have to understand, the psychological terror was now absolute. Solomon had looked death in the face. He had felt the rope tightening. He knew that Tibbets wasn't just a bad boss. He was a murderer who had been temporarily interrupted. William Ford had saved his life, yes, but Ford wasn't there all the time. Ford had other business, And the moment Ford rode away, the shield vanished. Solomon was trapped in a small, isolated world with a man who wanted him dead. It wasn't a matter of if the violence would happen again, but when. He didn't have to wait long. A few days later, Tybeats walked into the workshop. His eyes were cold, hard, and fixed on Solomon. He wasn't yelling this time. He was quiet. And that silence was more terrifying than any scream. He walked over to a workbench, picked up a hatchet, a sharp, heavy blade used for chopping wood, and turned to Solomon. "I'm gonna kill you," his eyes seemed to say, even if his mouth didn't form the words. Solomon didn't wait for the swing. The instinct for self-preservation, the same instinct that makes a deer bolt when a twig snaps, took over. He dropped his tools and ran. He burst out of the workshop door, his boots pounding against the hard-packed earth. Tybeats roared and chased after him, hatchet in hand. Imagine the scene, a man running for his life through a lumber yard, weaving between stacks of wood, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He reached the fence, a high wooden barrier meant to keep livestock in and slaves in. Solomon didn't slow down. He leaped, scrambling over the top just as Tybeats reached the bottom. He hit the ground on the other side and sprinted for the water. The bayou, the swamp. It was the only place a horse couldn't follow. It was the only cover he had. He plunged into the murky water, waist deep, pushing through the reeds and the mud. The Great Pine Wood Swamp is not a sanctuary. It is a nightmare landscape. It is a maze of cypress knees, stagnant black water, and tangled vines. And it is alive. As Solomon waded deeper, leaving the shouting Tybeats behind on the shore, he entered a world that belonged to the reptiles. Alligators floated like logs, their eyes watching the intruder. Water moccasins, deadly poisonous snakes, slithered through the branches that brushed against his face. The air was thick with mosquitoes that descended in clouds, biting every inch of exposed skin. But Solomon couldn't stop. He knew Tybeats would go for the dogs. The thought of the hounds, those baying, relentless tracking machines, put a terror in him that outweighed the fear of the snakes. He pushed on. He ran until his lungs burned. He ran until the sun went down and the swamp turned into a wall of black ink. He was lost. He was exhausted. He was wet, cold, and terrified. But he was alive. That night in the swamp was a test of sanity. Solomon found a dry patch of ground on a small island in the mire. He huddled there, shivering. The sounds of the bayou at night are a cacophony of screams, croaks, and splashes. Every splash could be a predator. Every shadow could be a man with a gun. He thought about running north. He looked at the stars, trying to find the North Star, the legendary guide for runaway slaves. But the reality crushed him. He was thousands of miles from New York. He had no food. He had no shoes. He had no map. If he tried to walk to Canada, he would die of starvation or be caught by patrollers, men who roamed the roads looking for runaways to claim the bounty. He realized with a sinking heart that escape was impossible. Not like this. He needed a plan. He needed leverage. So he made a decision that seems counterintuitive to us today. Instead of running away, he decided to run to the law, or at least the closest thing to it. He decided to run to William Ford's main plantation house, miles away, to plead his case. It was a gamble. If Tybeats caught him on the road, he was dead. If Ford refused to help, he was dead.
He moved at dawn. He skirted the edges of the roads, hiding in the brush whenever he heard a horse. He was a fugitive in his own country. When he finally arrived at Ford's house, he was a wreck, mud-covered, bleeding, wild-eyed. He collapsed at Ford's feet. He told him everything. He told him about the hatchet. He told him about the threats. He said, "Master Ford, I cannot live with Tybeats. He will kill me." Ford listened, and this is where the tragedy of the good master comes full circle. Ford protected him for the night. He fed him. He let him sleep in safety. But Ford admitted he couldn't break the contract. He had sold Solomon's labor to Tibbets. He couldn't just take him back without paying, and Ford didn't have the money. The law was on Tibbets' side. Property rights were more important than human rights. Ford's hands were tied by the very system he participated in. However, Ford knew that Tibbets would damage his property, so a compromise was reached. Solomon wouldn't go back to Tibbets. Instead, he would be sold again. He would be transferred to a new master. It felt like a victory at first. Anything was better than the man with the hatchet. But Solomon didn't know who was waiting for him. He was about to be sold to a man named Edwin Epps. If Tibbets was a weak, insecure bully, Edwin Epps was a true sociopath. He was a heavy-set, coarse man with a face constantly flushed from alcohol. He owned a plantation on Bayou Boeuf, deep in the cotton country. Epps didn't just believe in slavery, he reveled in it. He believed it was his God-given right to abuse, break, and use the people he owned. He was known as a nigger breaker. When Solomon arrived at the Epps plantation, the atmosphere was different. There was no reading of the Bible here. There was no kindness, there was only the whip. Epps carried it with him everywhere, coiled like a snake at his hip. He drank heavily, and when he was drunk, his cruelty became creative. The transition to Epps' plantation marked the beginning of the darkest decade of Solomon's life. Here he wasn't a carpenter or a mill worker, he was a field hand. He was given a sack and sent into the cotton rows. Now, picking cotton is an art form. It requires nimble fingers and a specific rhythm. Solomon, with his carpenter's hands, was clumsy at it. He was slow. And on the Epps plantation, slowness was a sin. At the end of every day, the cotton was weighed. Epps had a quota for every slave. If you fell short, you were whipped. 1 lash for every pound you were missing. The sound of the whip cracking at sunset became the soundtrack of Solomon's life. He would stand in line watching the scale, praying the needle would move far enough. The anxiety was constant. It was a life of terror, sweat, and blood, presided over by a man who laughed when he inflicted pain. And amidst this horror, Solomon met the person who would become the other central figure of his story. A young woman, barely more than a girl, with a spirit that shone even in the mud. Her name was Patsy, and her story would break Solomon's heart more than his own suffering ever could. To talk about the decades Solomon spent on Bayou Boeuf is to talk about Patsy. You cannot separate the story of Solomon Northup from the story of Patsy. In many ways, she is the heart of this tragedy, the symbol of the ultimate suffering that slavery could inflict. When Solomon arrived, Patsy was young, perhaps only 23 years old. She was described as a woman of striking beauty and incredible strength. In the fields, she was a phenomenon. They called her the Queen of the Fields. While a strong man might pick 200 or 300 pounds of cotton in a day, a task that is backbreaking enough to kill you slowly, Patsy could pick 500. Her fingers moved with a speed that defied logic. She was a machine of efficiency, a marvel of human endurance. She was the most valuable asset Edwin Epps owned. She made him rich. You would think, in a logical world, that this would earn her some respect, or at least some safety. But in the twisted, sick logic of the Epps plantation, her excellence was her curse. Edwin Epps was obsessed with Patsy. It wasn't love. Love requires seeing someone as a person. This was a dark, suffocating lust, mixed with the power of total ownership. He wanted to possess her completely. He forced himself on her. He claimed her body as his right. And this created a dynamic in the big house that was pure poison. Mistress Epps, Edwin's wife, knew exactly what was happening, but she didn't turn her anger towards her husband, the man who was breaking his vows and abusing a woman. No, she turned her hatred towards Patsy. This is one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the story, the way the system turned victims against victims. Mistress Epps was jealous. She saw Patsy not as a helpless slave being raped, but as a rival. She hated Patsy with a venomous, blinding fury. She would sit on the porch, sipping lemonade, and watch Patsy in the fields, her eyes burning with malice.
She would bribe the overseers to whip Patsy for no reason. She would throw heavy objects at her face. She demanded that Epps sell her, that he get rid of that woman.
But Epps refused. He wouldn't part with his queen. So poor Patsy was trapped between a monster who wanted to own her and a mistress who wanted to destroy her. There was no safe place for her. In the fields, Epps was there, touching her, leering at her. In the cabin, she lived in fear of the mistress coming down with a whip or a piece of stove wood. Solomon watched this unfold with a heavy heart. He and Patsy became friends, not in the way free people are friends, meeting for coffee or a walk, but in the way soldiers in a trench become friends. They were bonded by trauma. Solomon would listen to her weep at night. He would clean her wounds. He saw the scars on her back, a map of raised keloids that told the history of Epps' brutality. She was a woman of immense spirit. She had a lightness to her, a joy that tried to bubble up, but Epps was determined to crush it out of her, day by day. And then there were the nights. If the days were for labor, the nights were for a different kind of torture. Epps was a heavy drinker. He would often return from the town of Holmesville late at night, drunk and looking for entertainment. He would storm into the slave cabins at 2 or 3 in the morning. "Up, up," he would scream. "Dance, you niggers, dance!" He would drag them out of bed, exhausted men and women who had picked cotton for 14 hours, and force them into the main house. And here is where the violin comes back into the story. Solomon's gift, his beautiful music, was weaponized. Epps knew Solomon could play, so he would force Solomon to stand in the corner and play lively, happy jigs, and he would force the slaves to dance. Imagine the scene. It is 3 in the morning. You are half dead with fatigue. Your muscles are screaming, and you are forced to spin and clap and smile while a drunk man cracks a whip at your feet. If you slowed down, the whip snapped. If you looked sad, the whip snapped. Epps would laugh, a deep belly laugh, thinking this was grand entertainment. He would force Patsy to dance the hardest. He would make her spin until she collapsed. Solomon had to play through it all. He had to make the music sound happy while his eyes watched his friends suffer. It was a grotesque mockery of joy. The violin, which used to mean freedom and art to Solomon, now meant survival. It meant keeping Epps happy so he wouldn't kill anyone. Often these parties would last until dawn. They would get no sleep. The sun would rise, the horn would blow, and they would have to go straight back to the fields to pick their quota. If they missed the weight because they were tired, they got whipped again. It was a cycle of exhaustion designed to break the will completely. Solomon struggled in the fields. He wasn't like Patsy. His hands were made for carpentry and violin strings, not the rough bowls of cotton. He often fell short of his quota. He describes the anxiety of the weigh-in with terrifying clarity. Every evening they would march to the gin house with their sacks. Epps would sit by the scales with his slate and his whip. He would call out the names. Platt. Solomon would hang his sack on the hook. Epps would check the weight. If it was 10 pounds light, Epps would order him to lie down. 4 stakes were driven into the ground. Solomon's hands and feet would be tied to them, stretching him out like a hide being dried, and then the lash would fall. Solomon says he learned to strip his clothes off quickly because the whip cut less deep if it didn't have to go through the rough fabric of his shirt first. That is the kind of practical knowledge you acquire in hell, how to be beaten efficiently. Years passed this way. 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. The seasons blurred together. The hope of escape began to fade, replaced by a dull, aching acceptance. Solomon's hair began to gray. He saw men die of heat stroke. He saw women die in childbirth. He saw people whipped until they couldn't stand, then forced to work on their knees. He watched the light in Patsy's eyes dim. She stopped laughing. She stopped singing. She became a ghost haunting her own life. There's a moment where she comes to Solomon, holding a piece of broken glass. She looks at him with dead eyes and asks him a question that stops his heart. She asks him if God is real, and if he is, why does he hate them? Solomon didn't have an answer. How could he? The theology of the good Master Ford had no place here. Epps didn't pretend to be a Christian. He was a brute who believed that might made right.
B.S. Solomon tried to send letters.
Once, he managed to get his hands on a scrap of paper and a stolen nub of pencil. He wrote a desperate plea to his friends in the North. He had to be careful. It was illegal for a slave to write. If Epps found the paper, Solomon would be dead. He waited for weeks for an opportunity to mail it. He trusted a local white man, a darker-skinned fellow who seemed sympathetic, to drop it in the post office for him. He gave the man the letter and the few coins he had managed to hide. The man took the money, but he didn't mail the letter. He betrayed Solomon. He told Epps. Epps came to Solomon, furious, demanding to know if he was trying to write letters. Solomon, thinking fast, lied. He denied it with everything he had. He said he couldn't write. He said the man was a liar trying to stir up trouble. Epps, thankfully, was suspicious of the other man too, and he bought the lie. But it was a close call. Too close. Solomon realized he couldn't trust anyone, not the white neighbors, not the other slaves who might snitch to get a reward. He was completely, utterly alone. The isolation was as heavy as the chains. He was a man screaming into a void, and the only response was the echo of the whip. There is one day in this 12-year saga that stands out above all others as the absolute nadir, the lowest point of humanity that Solomon witnessed. It is the story of the soap. It sounds trivial, doesn't it? A bar of soap. But on the Epps plantation, a bar of soap became the catalyst for a scene of torture so grotesque it strains the imagination. You see, Mistress Epps hated Patsy with such a profound jealousy that she refused to give her soap. Patsy worked in the fields all day, sweating in the Louisiana heat, and she wanted to wash. She wanted to be clean. It was a basic shred of dignity, but Mistress Epps denied her even that. She wanted Patsy to feel dirty, to feel low. So one Sunday, the slave's only free day, Patsy disappeared. She didn't run away. She just walked over to a neighboring plantation owned by a man named Shaw. Shaw's wife was a black woman, a former slave he had elevated to mistress of the house. Patsy knew she could get a piece of soap from her. That was her crime. She walked a few miles to beg for a way to wash her skin. When Epps found out she was gone, the paranoia set in instantly. He didn't think, oh, she's visiting a friend. He thought she was running, or worse, in his twisted mind, he thought she was with another man. He paced the porch, drinking, his rage simmering like a pot on a boil. When Patsy finally returned in the afternoon, holding that small, precious piece of soap, Epps was waiting. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't listen when she tried to show him the soap. He saw disobedience. He saw his property acting with agency. And he decided to make an example of her that would terrify every soul on the bayou. He ordered the stakes to be driven into the ground. Now, we have to talk about staking out. It is a method of punishment designed to leave the victim completely helpless. 4 stakes are hammered deep into the earth. The person is forced to lie face down. Their wrists are tied to the top stakes, their ankles to the bottom ones. They are stretched taut. They cannot move an inch. They cannot curl up to protect their vital organs. They are presented to the whip like a canvas. Epps ordered the men to tie Patsy down. She didn't fight. She knew it was useless. She lay in the dirt, her dress stripped from her back, exposing the skin that was already a map of old scars. And then Epps did something that broke Solomon's heart. He didn't pick up the whip himself, not at first. He turned to Solomon. "You do it, Platt," he growled. "You give her the lashes." Imagine the horror. Solomon and Patsy were friends. They were the only comfort each other had. And now Epps was forcing Solomon to be the instrument of her torture. If Solomon refused, Epps would whip Solomon, and then he would whip Patsy anyway, probably harder. It was a trap, a psychological game. Solomon took the whip. His hands were shaking. He looked at Patsy, tied in the dirt. He looked at Epps, whose face was red with anticipation. Solomon swung the lash. He tried to do it lightly. He tried to make the crack loud, but the impact soft. He wanted to spare her, but Epps wasn't a fool. He knew the sound of a killing blow versus a show blow.
"Harder," he screamed. "Strike her or I'll kill you."
Solomon had to do it. He had to swing harder. He had to cut the skin of the woman who had begged him to end her life just weeks before. He whipped her until his own arm ached, until the tears were streaming down his face, blinding him. He counted the lashes. 10, 15, 20. Patsy screamed at first, terrible, gut-wrenching screams that echoed off the barn walls. But eventually, the screaming stopped. She just moaned, a low, guttural sound of a spirit breaking. Epps watched, criticizing Solomon's technique, shouting at him to lay it on. Finally, Epps decided it wasn't enough. It wasn't brutal enough. He pushed Solomon aside. "Give it to me," he snarled. "You don't know how to whip a nigger." Epps took the whip, and then the true butchery began. He didn't just whip her, he danced around her. He put his whole body weight into every blow. He whipped her with a manic energy, grunting with exertion. Solomon watched in helpless horror as the skin on Patsy's back literally flayed open. It wasn't just welts anymore, it was raw meat. The blood pooled in the dust, turning the gray earth to a dark, sticky mud. Epps whipped her until he was physically exhausted, until his arm couldn't lift the leather anymore. He stopped, panting, sweating, looking down at the ruin he had made of a human being. "That'll teach you to run off," he spat. They left her there for a while, untied but unable to move. Solomon eventually carried her to her cabin. He had to peel her dress off her wounds because the fabric had been beaten into the cuts. He cleaned her with salt and water, a painful but necessary treatment to prevent infection in the humid swamp air. Patsy didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just stared at the wall. That day, something in Patsy died. The queen of the fields, the vibrant young woman who could outwork any man, was gone. In her place was a broken shell. She healed physically. The human body is amazingly resilient. But she never smiled again. Her mind began to wander. She would have fits of madness. The light behind her eyes was extinguished. Solomon sat by her bedside that night, listening to her shallow breathing, and felt a rage so pure it almost consumed him. He looked at his own hands, the hands that had held the whip. He felt dirty. He felt complicit. This was the genius of the slave system. It made you a participant in your own degradation. It made you hurt the ones you loved just to survive. Solomon realized then that there was no bottom. There was no limit to the cruelty. Epps wasn't going to stop until they were all dead. The urgency to escape returned with a vengeance. It wasn't just about freedom anymore. It was about saving his soul. He had to get out before he became a monster himself. He had to get out before he forgot entirely who Solomon Northrop was. The weeks following the whipping were a grim blur. The plantation was silent. The other slaves moved like shadows, terrified that Epps's rage would turn on them next. Patsy eventually went back to the fields, but she was slower. She winced with every movement. Epps didn't seem to care. He had made his point. He had reasserted his dominance. But for Solomon, the clock was ticking louder than ever. He was growing older. His body was starting to feel the years of malnutrition and labor. He knew he had one, maybe two good chances left in him. If he failed again, if he was caught writing a letter or running away, he would end up like Patsy, or worse, he would end up hanging from a tree in the swamp. He needed a miracle. And as it happened, a miracle was about to arrive. Not in the form of an army or a raid, but in the form of a carpenter, a white man, a man with a hammer in his hand and a strange, dangerous idea in his head that slavery was wrong. His name was Bass, and his arrival would change everything. The miracle arrived in a wagon filled with tools. It was 1852. Solomon had been a slave for 11 years. 11 years of silence. 11 years of answering to Platt. The man who stepped out of the wagon was different from the usual faces on the bayou. His name was Bass. He was a carpenter from Canada, hired by Epps to help build a new house on the plantation. Now, Canada was a mythical place for slaves. It was the North Star. It was the land where the law said a black man was free. But Bass was here, deep in the South, looking for work. He was a strange character, middle-aged, a bit rough around the edges, with a habit of talking too much and too loudly. He didn't have that guarded, suspicious look that most white men in the area had. He had an opinion on everything, and he wasn't afraid to share it. Solomon was assigned to assist him. For weeks they worked side by side, sawing timber, planing boards, hammering nails. Solomon kept his head down, playing the part of the silent, obedient assistant, but his ears were wide open. He listened to every word Bass said, and what he heard made his heart race.
Bass was arguing with Epps. Now, nobody argued with Epps. You just nodded and agreed. But Bass was different. He told Epps, right to his face, that slavery was an abomination. He called it a sin against God. He said that no man had the right to own another man, that the law of the land was wrong, and that justice would eventually come. Epps just laughed. He thought Bass was a fool, a crazy northerner with soft ideas. "You'd change your tune if you lived here," Epps would sneer. But Bass stood his ground. He wasn't intimidated. He spoke with the conviction of a man who believed in the equality of souls. Solomon, working quietly in the corner, felt a spark ignite in his chest that he hadn't felt in a decade. Could this be it? Could this man be the key? But trust is a dangerous currency in a slave state. Solomon had been betrayed before. He remembered the man who took his money and almost got him killed. Was Bass real? Or was he a plant? Was he just another white man who liked the sound of his own voice but would turn a runaway in for a reward? The risk was astronomical. If Solomon spoke to Bass and Bass told Epps, Solomon was dead. Epps would just whip him this time. He would kill him. He would see it as the ultimate betrayal. Solomon agonized over this for days. He watched Bass. He studied his face when he thought no one was looking. He looked for kindness. He looked for honesty. Finally, he decided to take the leap. He had to. He was dying inside. The chance of freedom was worth the risk of death. It happened on a Sunday. Epps and his family had gone to church. The plantation was quiet. Bass was sitting alone in the unfinished house, eating his lunch. Solomon walked in. He checked the door. He checked the windows. His heart was hammering so hard he thought Bass might hear it. He approached the carpenter. "Master Bass," he started, his voice trembling, "I want to ask you something, but you must promise me, on your life, that you will not tell Master Epps." Bass looked up, surprised. He saw the intensity in the slave's eyes. He saw the intelligence that Platt usually hid. He put down his bread. "What is it?" he asked. "I promise." Solomon took a breath, and then he let the dam break. "I am not who you think I am," he said. "I am not Platt. I am Solomon Northup. I am a free citizen of New York." He told him everything. He told him about his wife, Anne, about his children, about the violin, about the kidnapping in Washington, about the 12 years of hell. He spoke for an hour, the words pouring out of him like blood from a wound. He showed Bass his hands, skilled in carpentry, hands that didn't belong in a cotton field. He spoke with the diction of an educated man, dropping the dialect he had been forced to adopt. Bass sat in silence. He listened. He didn't laugh. He didn't run. He looked at Solomon with wide, sorrowful eyes. And then he did something extraordinary. He believed him. He didn't ask for proof. The truth was ringing in every word Solomon spoke. "My God," Bass whispered, "this is a great injustice. This is a crime." He stood up and paced the room. He was agitated. He knew the danger, too. Helping a slave was a crime in Louisiana. If he was caught, he could be imprisoned or lynched by the local mob. But Bass was a man of principle. He looked Solomon in the eye and said, "I will help you. I will write the letters." They hatched a plan. It had to be done in absolute secrecy. They couldn't be seen writing together. So, late at night, by the light of a single candle, Bass wrote the letters. Solomon dictated them. One was addressed to William Perry, a shopkeeper in Saratoga who knew Solomon well. Another was addressed to Judge Cephas Proctor.
They were simple letters stating that Solomon was alive, that he was being held as a slave on the plantation of Edwin Epps in Marksville, Louisiana, and begging them to bring his free papers and rescue him. Bass promised to mail them from the post office in Marksville before he left the state. He was scheduled to leave in a few weeks.
The wait was excruciating. Bass left. The letters were gone. And now the silence returned. But this was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of anticipation. Every time a rider came down the road, Solomon's heart jumped. Was it news? Was it help? But days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Christmas came and went. The cotton was planted again. The heat returned, and nothing happened. Doubt began to creep in like a cold fog. Had Bass failed? Did he lose the letters? Did he get scared and throw them away? Or worse, did the letters arrive, and did his friends just not care? 12 years is a long time. People move on. Maybe Anne had remarried. Maybe they thought he was dead and didn't want to reopen old wounds. The thought that he might be forgotten was more painful than the whip. Solomon fell into a deep depression. He went through the motions of his work, but his spirit was hanging by a thread. He felt foolish for hoping. He told himself he should just accept his fate. He was Platt. He would die Platt. But unknown to Solomon, the machinery of justice was grinding into gear. It was slow. It was bureaucratic, but it was moving. The letters had arrived. Imagine the scene in Saratoga Springs. It's a normal day. A shopkeeper gets a letter with a strange postmark. He opens it. He reads the frantic scroll. He recognizes the name. Solomon. The man who vanished into thin air. The shock must have been electric. The news spread through the village. Solomon is alive. They didn't forget him. They hadn't moved on. His wife, Anne, was still there, still waiting, still hoping against all logic. The community rallied. But this wasn't as simple as driving down to pick him up. They needed legal authority. They needed proof. The fugitive slave law made things complicated. A white man couldn't just walk onto a plantation and take a slave. They needed the governor of New York involved. A lawyer named Henry Northup stepped forward. Now, the name is no coincidence. Henry was part of the family that had originally owned Solomon's father before freeing him. They felt a deep responsibility. Henry was a sharp, determined man. He gathered affidavits. He got signatures. He went to the governor. He was appointed as a special agent of the state of New York to recover the kidnapped citizen. It took months of legal wrangling. They had to be sure. They couldn't afford a mistake. Finally, armed with documents that bore the seal of the state, Henry Northup boarded a train. He was heading south. He was heading into the lion's den. He was coming for Solomon. But Solomon, sweating in the cotton fields of Bayou Buff, knew none of this. He was just watching the sun go down, wondering if he would ever see it rise over a free land again. Henry Northup arrived in Marksville, Louisiana with a briefcase full of documents and a heart of trepidation. You have to understand the atmosphere of the South in 1853. Tensions were high. The debate over slavery was tearing the country apart. A northern lawyer walking into town with a mandate to steal a slave back from a plantation owner was not just unwelcome, he was walking around with a target on his back. Henry moved carefully. He didn't storm in. He went to the courthouse. He found a local judge, a man named Waddle, and presented his case. He showed the governor's seal. He showed the affidavits proving Solomon was a free citizen. The law was on his side, but the law in the South was often what the local mob decided it was. Thankfully, Judge Waddle was a man of statutes. He respected the paperwork. He agreed to help, but there was a problem. Bass's letter hadn't specified which plantation Solomon was on. It just said Bayou Buff. That was a large area. If they went door to door asking for a slave named Solomon, word would spread. Epps would hide him or kill him to destroy the evidence. They had to be surgical. They decided to bring the local sheriff involved. They needed the force of the local law. They rode out in a carriage, Henry, the sheriff, and a local planter who knew the area. It was a cold January morning. The fields were brown and dormant. They drove down the dusty roads, past the rows of cabins, past the overseers on horseback. Henry scanned every face he saw. He hadn't seen Solomon in 12 years. Would he even recognize him?
12 years of slavery changes a man. It ages him, scars him, bends his back. Henry was looking for the vibrant violin-playing father he knew. He feared he would find a broken ghost. Meanwhile, on the Epps plantation, it was just another day of labor. Solomon was working on the new house, the very house Bass had helped build. He was up on the roof or near the structure, hammering, cutting. His mind was miles away, perhaps dwelling on the failure of his letters. He had given up hope. He was resigned to the rhythm of the hammer and the lash. Then he heard the sound of wheels. He looked up. A carriage was coming down the long driveway. This wasn't unusual. Visitors came sometimes. But something about this carriage felt different. It stopped in front of the house. Epps walked out to meet them, looking annoyed at the interruption. The sheriff stepped down. Then another man, a man in a dark suit, a man who didn't look like a farmer.
Solomon squinted. The sun was in his eyes. He watched the men talking. Epps was pointing at the fields, then at the house. He looked angry. He was shaking his head. The sheriff pointed toward Solomon. "Call that boy down," the sheriff said. Epps, fuming, yelled for Platt. Solomon put down his hammer. His heart began to thud, a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He climbed down the ladder. He walked toward the group. He kept his head down, as a slave was trained to do. He looked at his dusty boots. He didn't dare hope. "Look up, boy," the sheriff said. Solomon lifted his head. He looked at the sheriff. Then he looked at the man in the suit. The man was staring at him intensely, searching his face, looking for the young man inside the weathered, gray-bearded slave. Solomon looked back. The face was familiar. It was a face from a dream, a face from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The nose, the eyes, the way he stood. "Solomon?" the man whispered. It was Henry. The world stopped spinning. The sounds of the plantation, the birds, the wind, the distant voices dropped away. There was only Henry. Solomon's knees went weak. He couldn't breathe. He tried to speak, but his throat was tight. Tears welled up in his eyes, hot and stinging. "Henry!" he choked out. "I know him! I know him!" he shouted, turning to the sheriff. "This is Henry Northup. I am Solomon." The reaction was instantaneous. Epps went ballistic. He turned a shade of purple that looked dangerous. "What is this?" he screamed. "This is my nigger. I bought him. I paid for him. You're not taking him anywhere." He looked ready to fight. He put his hand near his hip, perhaps reaching for a weapon. But the sheriff stepped in. "Stand down, Epps," he warned. "This man has papers from the governor of New York. If this is Solomon Northup, he is free." Epps sputtered. He cursed. He called it a scam. He called it theft. "He's a liar," Epps snarled. "He's fooled you all." But Henry was calm. He started asking questions. "What are your children's names? Who was your wife? What is the name of the neighbor who lived across the street?" Solomon answered every single one. He knew the details only a father and husband would know. The proof was irrefutable. The sheriff nodded. "It's him," he said. "He's free." The chains of 12 years didn't fall off with a clank. They fell off with a signature. The sheriff told Solomon to go get his things. Epps was still shouting, threatening to sue, threatening to kill everyone involved. He was a man watching his property walk away, and his ego couldn't handle it. But he was powerless against the law that had finally shown up. Solomon ran to the cabin. He didn't have much, a few rags, his violin, the violin that had saved his life and tormented his soul. He grabbed it. He was shaking so hard he could barely hold it. He ran back to the carriage. But then he stopped. Standing there, near the fence, was Patsy. She had heard the commotion. She had come from the fields. She saw the carriage. She saw Solomon with his bundle. She knew. She understood instantly. He was leaving. Her friend. Her protector. The only person in this hellhole who treated her like a human being. He was going back to the world of the living. And she was staying. She was staying with Epps. She was staying with the mistress who hated her. She was staying with the whip. Solomon looked at her. The joy of his freedom collided with a wall of guilt so thick it was suffocating. How could he leave her? How could he walk away and leave her to this monster? But he had no choice. The papers were for him. He had no legal power to take her. He was a black man in the South.
He was barely getting out with his own life. Patsy didn't scream. She didn't beg him to take her because she knew he couldn't. She just looked at him with tears streaming down her face. She hugged him, a desperate, clinging hug. "Oh, Platt," she cried, "I'm glad. I'm so glad you're free." But the pain in her voice was shattering. "Don't forget me," she whispered. "Don't forget Patsy." Solomon climbed into the carriage. He felt like a traitor. As the carriage pulled away, the wheels kicking up dust, he looked back. He saw Epps still raging on the porch, and he saw Patsy, a small, solitary figure standing by the fence, watching him disappear. She grew smaller and smaller, until she was just a dot in the vast, cruel landscape of the cotton fields. Then the carriage turned a corner, and she was gone. Solomon sat back in the seat. He was free. The air rushing past him was the air of liberty, but his heart was heavy. He wept. He wept for joy, yes, but mostly he wept for Patsy. He wept for the millions who were still there, behind the fences, watching the carriages ride away without them. He had escaped the fire, but he had left part of his soul in the ashes. The journey home began. A steamboat up the Mississippi, a train across the country. Every mile was a shedding of the skin of Platt. He watched the South recede. He watched the landscape change to the familiar woods of the North. He was going back to life. But the question remained, what kind of life was waiting for him? 12 years is a lifetime. Were his children still there? Did they remember him? Was Anne still his wife? He was returning from the dead, and the world of the living is a strange place for a ghost. Solomon stood on the steps of the courthouse, watching his tormentor leave. It was a bitter pill to swallow. He had his freedom back, yes, but he would never have justice. The system that allowed him to be stolen was the same system that protected the thief. It was a harsh lesson. Freedom is not the same thing as equality. But Henry put a hand on his shoulder. "Let's go home, Solomon," he said. And really, that was the only victory that mattered now. Home. They took the final train north to New York. They traveled to Glens Falls, where Anne and the children had moved. It was January 21, 1853, a cold, snowy day, the kind of winter day Solomon hadn't seen in over a decade. The snow crunched under his boots, a sound so distinct, so crisp, it must have triggered a flood of memories. They walked to the house. Solomon's heart was pounding harder than it ever had in the cotton fields. This was the moment of truth. What would he find? He knocked on the door. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The story broke. The newspapers picked it up. The kidnapped citizen restored. It was a sensation. People wanted to hear him speak. They wanted to know the truth about the peculiar institution. Solomon realized he had a new purpose. He couldn't just go back to being a carpenter. He had a voice now, and he had to use it for those who had none. He had to use it for Patsy. He began to work on his book. He sat down with a writer named David Wilson. He dictated every detail. He wanted it to be accurate. He wanted the names, the dates, the places to be undeniable. He wasn't writing a novel. He was writing an indictment. 12 Years a Slave was published later that year. It sold 30,000 copies. It shocked the nation. For the first time, people in the North who had been indifferent to slavery were reading a first-hand account of the torture, the sexual abuse, and the psychological destruction of human beings. Solomon traveled the lecture circuit. He stood on stages in front of white audiences and told them, "I was a free man like you, and they made me an animal." He forced them to look in the mirror. But the story doesn't end with a happily ever after. The tragedy of Solomon Northup lingers even after his return. He spent years trying to get justice, trying to sue the kidnappers, but the laws were stacked against him. He never received a dime of compensation. And then, the mystery of the end. We know he toured, we know he spoke, but then He vanished again. History loses track of Solomon Northup around 1863. Did he die peacefully in his bed? Did he fall victim to slave catchers again during the Civil War? We don't know. The man who fought so hard to be remembered eventually faded into the mists of history. But he left us his book. He left us his testimony. And that testimony is a monument that no amount of time can erode. Solomon Northup's story eventually fades into the mists of history, leaving us with a final haunting mystery. After traveling the country, speaking to thousands, and laying bare the ugly truth of his ordeal, the man simply vanished. Around 1863, right in the midst of the Civil War, the very war that would finally break the chains he wore, Solomon disappeared from the public record. Some say he died quietly among family. Others fear he was kidnapped again, snatched back into the darkness by vengeful men. We will likely never know. But in a way, his physical end matters less than what he left behind. He left us a mirror. He held it up to America in 1853, and he holds it up to us today.
Think about the sheer impossibility of his survival. He endured 12 years of physical torture, starvation, and the psychological crushing of his identity. Yet he never let the Solomon inside him die. He hid his true self like a diamond in a handful of mud, protecting it from men like Epps and Tybeats until the day he could shine again. That is the lesson here. It isn't just a history lesson about slavery. It is a lesson about the indomitable strength of the human spirit. It teaches us that you can strip a man of his name, you can strip him of his clothes, you can beat him until he cannot stand. But there is a spark, a tiny, stubborn, divine spark of dignity that is almost impossible to extinguish if you refuse to let it go. But there is a warning here, too, a terrifying one. Solomon was a free man. He had papers, he had status, he had rights. And it all evaporated in a single afternoon because of the greed of two men and the indifference of a system. It shows us that freedom is not a permanent state of nature. It is a fragile thing that must be guarded. It can be stolen. It can be legislated away. It can be ignored by a judge or a sheriff who decides to look the other way. The line between a citizen and a slave, between a person and a thing, is thinner than we like to admit. So as we close this chapter, imagine Solomon one last time, not as the broken slave Platt, and not even as the famous author. Imagine him as he was in that first scene, a man with a violin. He is sitting on his porch in Glens Falls, surrounded by the grandchildren he almost never saw. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the grass. He lifts the bow. He plays a note. It's a sad sound, full of the memories of the bayou, the cries of Patsy, and the long, hot days of the cotton fields. But as the melody rises, it changes. It becomes strong. It becomes defiant. It is the sound of a man who walked through hell and came back to tell the tale. The music floats on the wind, drifting over the houses, over the towns, echoing down through the years to reach us right now. It tells us to listen. It tells us to remember. And most importantly, it tells us to never, ever take our freedom for granted. Because Solomon Northup's story isn't just about what happened to him. It's about what could happen to any of us if we stop paying attention. What do you think was justice? Comment below and subscribe the channel Rooted in Chains.